These words come from the memories of Nancy Wake. They believed I was harmless. They looked at me and saw a woman who should have been at home, polite and quiet, obedient to the world they built. They never imagined I would become the enemy they feared most. I remember the first time I learned the Gestapo had given me a name, the White Mouse, a creature that slipped through their fingers no matter how many traps they set. It amused me at first. Then I understood what it meant. They had noticed me. They were watching. There were days when I could feel the hunt tightening around me. Whispers in cafes, sudden silence when I entered a room, the sense that eyes were lingering on my back for a second too long. France was full of shadows then, but some of them were looking for me. I hadn't set out to become anyone's enemy. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to fight a war. But when evil rises around you, when people are beaten in the streets and stripped of dignity, you learn very quickly what you're made of. And you either turn away and pretend not to see, or you stand up and do something about it. I chose to stand. There is a moment in every life when the world tests you. Mine began long before the men in gray coats knew my name, long before they pressed my photographs into folders and demanded my capture. To understand how I became their so-called white mouse, you must know where I came from. Because no one is born fearless. Fear grows in you, and so does the strength to overcome it. I wasn't always being hunted. Once, I was just a girl on the far side of the world, dreaming of something more. I grew up far from the war-torn streets of Europe. To most people, New Zealand was a quiet corner of the world, a place where storms came from the sea, not from governments or armies. If you had told anyone there that a girl from Wellington would one day become a target of the Gestapo, they would have laughed. I might have laughed too. But life has a way of shaping you long before you realize what it is preparing you for. Looking back, I can see the threads that pulled me forward. Small moments, small injustices, small rebellions, long before the world gave them names. I never liked bullies, never tolerated cruelty. Even as a child, I felt my body fill with a sharp, cold fire whenever I saw someone being mistreated. I did not know it then, but that fire would become my strength. Years later, when the war arrived and the world turned dark, that same fire refused to let me stand aside. It pushed me to act, to resist, to fight. But it began long before Europe, long before the uniforms and the checkpoints and the coded messages. It began with the girl I was, half a world away. So before I tell you how I slipped through the Germans' grasp, how I ran, fought, and refused to break, I must start at the beginning. Because the woman they hunted was built on the memories of the girl I once was. And that story begins not with fear, nor with danger, but with a childhood that taught me how to survive. I was born in Wellington, New Zealand, in 1912. My earliest memories are of the sea wind and the sound of gulls, the kind of childhood that feels simple only when you look back on it from a great distance. My father left when I was young. One day he was there, and the next he was gone, taking more than just our security with him. My mother tried to hold everything together, but there are some absences that echo for years. When I was still a child, we moved to Australia. The journey felt like crossing into another life. We settled in Sydney, and my mother worked hard to keep us afloat. There wasn't much room for weakness in our home. We were expected to be strong, to keep our heads high, to endure whatever came. I learned early that the world would not hand me anything simply because I wanted it. If I wanted a place in it, I would have to carve it myself. I was stubborn, sharp-tongued, and quick to push back if someone tried to put me in my place. Teachers called me difficult. I preferred the word determined. School did not hold my interest for long. I was far more fascinated by the world beyond the classroom walls, by people, by stories, by the sense that life was happening somewhere else, somewhere bigger. I remember looking at maps and feeling a pull across the oceans, as if Europe itself were calling my name. Even as a girl, I sensed injustice like a change in the weather. When I saw someone being picked on or humiliated, something inside me tightened. I could not simply stand and watch. I stepped in, even when it meant taking the blows myself. I did not yet know the name for what I felt. Later, they would call it courage. At the time, it just felt like anger. Those early years taught me resilience. They taught me that fear could be pushed aside, that pain could be swallowed, and that no one had the right to decide my worth. These lessons would become my armor long before I ever stood against soldiers or secret police. But the most important lesson came quietly. The world is much larger than the one you are born into, and if you are brave enough, you can claim a piece of it for yourself. As I grew older, the thought of staying in Australia felt unbearable. I wanted more than a predictable life, more than marriage and routine and the narrow expectations placed on women of my time. I didn't know exactly what I was searching for, only that it wasn't there. By the time I reached my late teens, I had made up my mind. I would leave. I saved what little money I could, took small jobs, and held on to a stubborn belief that there was a life waiting for me somewhere beyond the horizon. People told me I was foolish, reckless, unrealistic. Perhaps I was, but I would rather have been reckless than trapped. When I finally boarded the ship that would take me away from Australia, I felt a sense of relief that settled deep in my bones. I stood on the deck and watched the coastline shrink behind me. I wasn't running from something. I was running toward something: freedom, opportunity, a chance to become someone of my own making. I did not know then what that journey would cost me or what it would give me in return. I only knew that my life would not be defined by limitations drawn by others. I sailed toward the world with a suitcase, a fierce temper, and an unshakable belief that I was meant for something more. I had no idea that the path ahead would lead me directly into the heart of a war, into danger, into loss, into love, and into the shadows where ordinary people chose to resist. But that decision, to step onto that ship and leave everything familiar behind, was the first act of courage that shaped who I would become. I left as a girl in search of a life. I would return a woman forged by war. When I arrived in Europe, it felt as if I had stepped into the center of the world. London was alive with energy, a place where ideas and ambitions collided on every street. I found small jobs and made enough to survive, but it wasn't the work that mattered. It was the feeling of being exactly where life was happening. Still, as much as I admired London, it was Paris that captured me. Paris was a heartbeat. It was elegance and chaos and brilliance woven together. I moved there with a sense of certainty, as if I had finally found the place my younger self had been reaching for across oceans and maps. In Paris, I worked as a journalist. I was young, curious, and eager to prove myself. The world was changing fast, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes, not simply read about it from afar. Journalism gave me a front seat to history, though at the time, I did not realize how dark that history was about to become. One of my early assignments took me to Germany. I remember stepping off the train and feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was tension in the air, a heaviness that clung to the streets and to the people moving silently through them. I had never seen anything like it. I witnessed the rise of the Nazis not through headlines, but through the way ordinary people behaved. Fear was everywhere. Men in uniform strutted with an authority that dared you to challenge them. I saw Jewish families being harassed in the streets, shoved aside as if they were nothing. Shops marked, dignity stripped, voices silenced. I stood there, watching, and something inside me hardened. I had always despised bullies, but this was cruelty on a scale I had never imagined. It wasn't just wrong. It was intolerable. I returned to France a changed woman. The images stayed with me. The cries, the humiliation, the look in the eyes of those who suffered while others turned away. Many people in Paris shrugged it off, believing the storm would pass, believing it was not their concern. But I had seen what was coming. I could feel it. And I knew that if the world allowed this to grow, it would swallow everything. When I settled back into life in France, I tried to hold on to the beauty of Paris, the cafes filled with laughter, the late evenings by the river, the feeling that the world was full of possibility. But beneath the charm, I could sense a quiet denial. People preferred not to see the gathering storm. They called it politics, a phase, a distant problem that would never touch them. I knew better. I had looked into the eyes of those already living under Nazi rule. I had seen what blind obedience and silence could do to a nation. It begins with whispers, with small injustices, with people convincing themselves that staying silent is the safest choice. Then, one day, it is too late to speak at all. Still, life carried on, as life always does before it breaks. I laughed with friends, attended parties, and walked through Paris with the feeling of someone who was exactly where she belonged. I didn't yet know that this city I loved would soon be under the heel of the very men I had seen terrorizing the streets of Germany. I was not a soldier. I had no training, no plan, no sense that I would ever take part in a war. But something inside me was alert, waiting. Watching history shift, I felt an unease I couldn't ignore. The world was changing, and so was I. Looking back, I can see that Paris was the last breath of innocence in my life. The last time I believed that courage would never be demanded of me. The last time I could pretend that someone else would stop what was coming. War had not yet reached France, but it was moving closer, and soon, none of us would be able to escape its shadow. When I met Henri Fiacca, I was not looking for love. I was looking for a future, a sense of belonging, perhaps a place to rest after years of chasing the world. But love has a way of appearing when you least expect it, and Henri changed the course of my life in ways I could never have foreseen. Henri was a French industrialist, elegant, confident, and kind in a way that immediately disarmed me. He treated me as an equal, not as an ornament, and he saw strength in me where others had seen only stubbornness. He had a calm manner that balanced my fiery nature, and together we discovered a happiness that felt both rare and effortless. Life in Marseille with Henri was a world away from the tension I had witnessed in Germany. The sea, the sunlight, the lively streets, everything felt warmer there. For a time, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps I could build a peaceful life, that war was still far enough away to ignore. We married, and I became Nancy Fiacca. Our home was filled with laughter, friends, dinners that stretched late into the night. Henri was well respected, and through him, I met people from every corner of society, artists, businessmen, politicians. It was a life many would have envied. But even during those moments of comfort, I could not forget what I had seen across the border. The memory lingered like a shadow at the edge of a bright room. I read the newspapers, listened to the conversations, watched the shifting tone of Europe with a knot in my stomach. People around us still believed that reason would prevail, that Hitler would settle, that diplomacy and time would calm the rising storm. But I had seen the truth with my own eyes. There was no calming such a hunger for power. Henri and I rarely spoke about politics in those early days. We were enjoying the life we had built together, holding tightly to ordinary happiness before the world forced us to choose between comfort and conscience. I think we both felt the change coming, but neither of us wanted to be the one to name it. For a brief moment in my life, I experienced what peace could feel like. It was fragile, beautiful, and fleeting. As the months passed, it became harder to ignore the tightening grip of events across Europe. Conversations at dinner changed. What began as murmurs of concern became serious discussions about alliances, invasions, and the pace at which Hitler was advancing. Friends who once dismissed my warnings now spoke with anxiety in their voices. Marseille remained lively, as if refusing to surrender its spirit to the possibility of war. But beneath the charm of the port city, tension was rising. Refugees began to appear, families who had fled the north, exhausted and frightened, carrying their lives in small suitcases. They arrived with stories that echoed what I had seen in Germany, only now the danger was moving closer, city by city, border by border. I remember looking out over the harbor one evening, the air still warm, lights reflecting on the water, and thinking how quickly a life could change. One moment you are laughing at a cafe, the next you are forced to decide here or when the world begins to fall apart. Henri saw the worry in my eyes long before the war reached our doorstep. He never tried to silence it. He listened. He understood that pretending would not stop what was coming. We didn't yet know the price we would pay for resisting, but even then, I think we both sensed that peace would not be ours to keep. Love made what followed both harder and more necessary. Harder because I had something to lose. Necessary because I could not imagine standing by while others suffered as I enjoyed a safety that was slipping away from them. Those years in Marseille were the final chapter of my life before the war changed everything. The last time I knew the comfort of a home untouched by fear. The last time I could look at Henri without wondering how long we would have together. War had not yet reached France, but it was on its way. And once it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. When war finally reached France, it did not arrive with a single moment of shock, but with a steady, unstoppable advance. News traveled quickly. Germany had invaded Poland, then Belgium, then the Netherlands. Each headline tightened the air in every French household, yet many still clung to the hope that France would endure, that the Maginot Line would hold, that the enemy would be stopped long before reaching us. Hope can be a dangerous comfort. I remember the day Paris fell. People spoke of it in whispers, as if the volume of their voices might change the truth. Radio broadcasts trembled with panic. Families fled south, thousands of them, pouring into the roads with carts, bicycles, children in their arms. Henri and I watched the streams of people moving through the streets of Marseille, and the war that once felt distant was suddenly at our door. The occupation changed everything. Overnight, fear became part of daily life. German soldiers marched through cities with a confidence that chilled the blood. Curfews were set. Freedom shrank. Newspapers printed what they were told. Anyone could disappear for a careless word. I could not ignore what was happening around me. I had seen the beginning of this darkness in Germany, and now it had swallowed France. It was no longer enough to simply be outraged. Anger without action felt like cowardice. It began small. A friend asked for help. Someone needed a place to hide for a night before moving on. Then another. Then a request to deliver a message quietly and to tell no one. I said yes because there was no other answer I could live with. I found myself stepping into the early threads of what would become the resistance, though at the time there was no grand name for it. It was simply people refusing to surrender their humanity. People helping one another survive the impossible. The more I witnessed, the more certain I became I would not sit safely behind walls while others were hunted, humiliated, and broken. If the war was going to consume our lives, then I would decide how I faced it. I chose not to bow. I chose to resist. At first, my actions felt almost insignificant compared to the scale of what was happening. A document delivered, a safe route shared, a warning whispered in time for someone to escape. But small acts of courage have a way of multiplying, and soon, those small actions connected me to others who would not stay silent. Through acquaintances, I was introduced to people who were already working against the Nazis in the shadows. They were ordinary men and women, teachers, shopkeepers, students, bound together by the simple belief that France must not surrender its soul, even if its government had. What struck me most was not their fear, but their determination. They had no uniforms, no powerful weapons, no armies behind them. Yet they were willing to risk everything. Their lives, their families, their futures. I remember thinking that if they could do it, then I had no excuse not to do the same. Henri worried for me, of course. He understood the danger better than anyone. But he never tried to stop me. He once told me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. His support strengthened my resolve, and his belief in me became one of the reasons I dared to go further. France was changing. People were forced to choose who they would be under occupation. Some cooperated, hoping to stay safe. Others looked away, convincing themselves they had no choice. And then there were those who refused to let fear dictate their conscience. I knew which kind of person I wanted to be. The path ahead was uncertain, and I understood that stepping onto it would mean leaving the comfort of the life Henri and I had built. But comfort felt like a betrayal when others were suffering. I could no longer stand at the edge of the storm. I had to step into it. So I did. My early steps into the resistance were cautious, almost quiet. There were no grand meetings, no dramatic oaths, no sudden transformation from civilian to fighter. It began with trust, earned carefully, shared carefully, because a single careless word could destroy everything. I was introduced to members of an underground network that would later become one of the lifelines of the resistance. At the time, it was simply a handful of determined people working in the shadows, connected by courage and secrecy. They taught me the first rule: trust no one fully, not even those on your side. The stakes were too high, and betrayal was always a possibility. My first tasks were simple: delivering messages, guiding people to safe houses, gathering small amounts of information. I learned quickly that success depended more on calm nerves and instinct than on physical strength. A steady gaze and a quick smile could get you through checkpoints far more effectively than a weapon. I made myself useful. I listened. I observed. I took risks that grew slightly bolder each time, pushing the line of what I thought I could manage. With every success came another request, another task, another person who needed help fleeing the tightening fist of the occupation. Word spread quietly that I could be relied upon, that I was resourceful, that I never hesitated. People began to seek me out when there was a life at stake or a message too dangerous to entrust to just anyone. I didn't see myself as brave. I simply felt that doing nothing would have been unbearable. But even in those early days, fear was a constant companion. It was there when I walked into a cafe to pass a coded note, when I knocked on a stranger's door to deliver instructions, when German patrols appeared without warning. I learned to mask fear with composure, to breathe slowly, to appear calm even when my heart was racing. The occupation forced you to grow a second skin, one that could withstand the threat of being searched, questioned, or taken away at any moment. I discovered I had a talent for deception, not for cruelty, but for survival and for saving others. What began as small acts soon became something larger. The network expanded, the dangers increased, and my role evolved with them. I was no longer simply helping. I was becoming part of the machinery working against the enemy. The work demanded constant awareness. A wrong turn, a familiar face appearing at the wrong moment, a conversation overheard, any of it could unravel everything. I learned to read a room the moment I stepped inside, to notice who was watching and who was pretending not to. I memorized exits, patrol schedules, and the shifting moods of the city under occupation. Some of the people I helped were terrified. Others were exhausted, starving, or numb from loss. They trusted me with their lives, and I carried the weight of that trust with a seriousness I had never felt before. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying every step of the day, wondering if I had missed something, if I had put someone in danger without realizing it. But there were also moments of relief, even joy. The quiet handshake of someone who had made it safely across a border. A family reunited. A friend spared from arrest by minutes. These were the victories that fueled us, the small sparks of light in a world that was growing darker each day. It became clear that I had a natural ability to move unnoticed, to slip through places where others drew attention. I understood how to disguise my intentions behind charm or simplicity, how to become someone no one bothered to look at twice. In a world watched by hostile eyes, invisibility became my greatest advantage. I didn't set out to be fearless. I was afraid often. But fear stopped mattering when weighed against the lives depending on me. I learned to act despite it, to carry it with me without letting it control me. The resistance was not a single organization then, but a scattered mosaic of people fighting in their own ways. Each act of defiance felt like a small stone thrown at a giant. But the stones were gathering, and soon they would form something powerful enough to be seen. I did not yet know how deeply I would become involved, or how far the fight would take me. But I was no longer on the sidelines. I had stepped into the shadows with a purpose, and there was no turning back. As the occupation tightened and the resistance grew, my work became bolder. What began as carrying messages soon evolved into escorting people across borders, arranging escape routes, and coordinating operations that directly undermined the Germans. I discovered that the very traits society had once told me to soften, my determination, my quick thinking, my refusal to be intimidated, were the same traits that now kept us alive. I learned the art of moving through the city as if I belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. I wore clothes that drew no attention, held myself with confidence, and spoke with a calmness that made officials think twice before questioning me. I carried forged documents, coded notes, and instructions hidden in the most ordinary objects. More than once, I walked past German soldiers with information that could have gotten dozens of people killed. There were checkpoints where officers waved me through with a dismissive gesture, assuming that a woman alone posed no threat. They underestimated me, and I used that underestimation as a weapon. The very prejudice that sought to keep women small became the reason I could operate so effectively. While they were busy watching the men, I slipped right past them. I learned how to improvise under pressure. Once, when a German patrol stopped me on a train and demanded my papers, I felt the faintest tremor of fear. The officer looked at me suspiciously, questioning why I was traveling alone. I met his gaze, laughed lightly, and told him I was on my way to visit a sick aunt. I acted annoyed, as if his suspicion insulted me. The officer backed down, embarrassed, and let me go. If he had searched my bag, he would have found documents that would have condemned me instantly. Stories like that began to spread quietly among the resistance. They said I could talk my way past anyone, that I had a gift for slipping through the Germans' fingers. Soon, the Gestapo started hearing my name. They didn't know exactly who I was, only that there was a woman in Marseille interfering with their operations, helping people vanish before they could be interrogated. A woman who always seemed one step ahead. They began to call me the White Mouse. At first, I laughed at the nickname. It sounded almost childish, like something from a storybook. But I soon realized it carried weight. A mouse may be small, but it can slip through cracks, disappear into shadows, and disrupt a house far larger than itself. The more the Germans failed to catch me, the more that name became a mark of their frustration. The more successful our operations became, the more determined the Gestapo was to stop me. They began to circulate descriptions, questioning anyone who might have seen a woman matching my appearance. My name was whispered in corridors and written in reports, though they still lacked a clear image of who they were chasing. There were moments when their frustration became almost visible. A raid would take place only hours after we had moved a group to safety. A checkpoint would be set up just minutes after I had passed through with forged documents. Each failure chipped away at their sense of control. For an occupying force built on fear, losing control was intolerable. I remember hearing that an officer, red with anger, had slammed his fist on a desk and shouted that they must catch that cursed white mouse. His rage meant we had succeeded. Every life saved, every operation completed, was a small humiliation for them. And humiliation is a language tyrants cannot bear. But the danger was real. Each success came at a cost. The Gestapo intensified their efforts, interrogating anyone suspected of helping the resistance. Some of the people I worked with were arrested. Some never returned. Their absence was a constant reminder of the price of defiance. Still, the work continued. We adapted. We changed routes, changed signals, changed everything that could compromise us. I knew I was being hunted, but fear no longer stopped me. If anything, it sharpened my resolve. The more the Gestapo pushed, the more determined I became to stay ahead of them. It wasn't pride. It was necessity. If I faltered, others would pay the price. I had become a problem the Germans could not solve. A woman they could not control, could not silence, could not catch. And with each failure, their anger grew. What they did not yet understand was that I hadn't even begun to fight. As the months passed, the Gestapo's search for me intensified. I began to notice the change in the air. It was no longer a matter of slipping past suspicion or staying cautious at checkpoints. My name was now spoken with urgency. I had moved from being an inconvenience to becoming a priority target. It started with rumors. I heard from contacts that interrogations often included the same question: have you seen the woman who helps them escape? The vague description that once protected me was now narrowing. Details were being pieced together. My hair, my height, my accent, small fragments of information that, if combined, could become a noose. A price was placed on my head, a reward for information leading to my capture. I never cared to know the exact amount. The number didn't matter. What mattered was that betrayal now had currency. Anyone, neighbors, acquaintances, even someone I once trusted, could be tempted to trade my life for their safety or profit. I became more careful. I changed my routes, changed the cafes I visited, changed the times I left home. I learned to sense danger the way one senses a storm approaching, long before the first drop of rain. I could feel it in the silence of a street, the glance of a passerby, the sudden presence of German soldiers where they hadn't been before. There were close calls, moments when I left a location only minutes before a raid, or when someone warned me not to return home because the Gestapo had been asking questions. I began sleeping in different places, never staying long enough to create a pattern. Routine became a luxury I could no longer afford. The truth weighed on me quietly. Every step I took placed Henri in danger as well. He knew it, and I knew it, though neither of us spoke of it directly. Love does not shield you in times of war, it magnifies the stakes. Each time I saw him, I held his gaze a little longer, wondering how many more moments we would have. But even as the walls closed in, I refused to stop. The more desperate the Germans became to find me, the more I understood the impact of what we were doing. If they wanted me this badly, then we were hurting them. And that meant we were making a difference. I accepted the danger as the cost of resistance. If I had to trade my safety so that others could escape with their lives, then it was a price I was willing to pay. The Gestapo began questioning people connected to me. Friends were watched. Some were taken for interrogation. A few never returned, and their absence carved a hollow place in my chest. The war demanded sacrifices, but knowing that others suffered because of their loyalty to me was a burden I carried in silence. I learned to live with the constant awareness that any day could be the day I was caught, that a knock at the door could be the last sound I heard as a free woman. Yet fear became something almost separate from me, like a coat I put on each morning, but refused to let weigh me down. There was a moment, one I have never forgotten, when I walked past a wall plastered with notices from the Gestapo. Lost documents, curfew reminders, and among them, a description that felt far too familiar. A woman of my age, my hair, my manner. They still didn't have my name, but they had come close enough that I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I stared at that notice for a heartbeat too long. Anyone watching might have seen through me, but I forced myself to move on, to keep walking at the same pace, to blend once more into the rhythm of the street. Only when I turned a corner did I allow myself to breathe. That was the moment I understood. It was only a matter of time before they identified me fully. Staying in Marseille would soon become impossible. And if I fell into their hands, I knew what fate awaited me. The Gestapo did not simply arrest people like me. They broke them. They destroyed them. And worse, they used them to destroy others. I told myself I would not let that happen. I would not be the reason names were extracted, networks exposed, families torn apart. If the day came when I could no longer run, I would choose what happened next. The decision settled inside me like steel. But I was not ready to give up. Not yet. I still had work to do, people to protect, and a duty I had claimed long before my name was ever whispered in those dark corridors. The net was tightening. I could feel it. And soon, I would have to make a choice that would change the course of my life, and the life of the man I loved, forever. The day came when staying in France was no longer an act of courage, but a death sentence. The Gestapo had gathered enough information to narrow their search, and I knew that if they caught me, the consequences would be far worse than my own execution. They would use me to dismantle everything we had built, to hump the people who trusted me. I could not allow that. Leaving was the only way to continue the fight. Saying goodbye to Henri was the hardest thing I had ever done. We did not make grand speeches or promises. War strips you of those illusions. We held each other in silence, knowing the weight of what we could not say. I told him I would return. I meant it with all my heart, though a part of me feared that fate would not allow it. I joined a group making its way toward the Pyrenees. The journey to Spain was treacherous, a path used by countless others fleeing the tightening grip of the occupation. We traveled mostly at night, through forests and mountain trails, guided by people who risked their lives with every crossing. The cold bit into our skin. Hunger gnawed at us. Exhaustion settled into our bones. The Pyrenees were not simply mountains, they were a test. A test of will, of endurance, of the human spirit under pressure. Each step felt heavier than the last. Some of the people with us struggled to continue, and we had to pull them forward, urging them to hold on. The sound of dogs barking in the distance or a gunshot echoing through the night reminded us that if we were caught, the journey would end in captivity or worse. I remember one night in particular. Snow covered the ground, and the wind cut through us like a blade. We moved in silence, our breaths wide in the air, our footsteps muffled. My legs burned with pain, and for the first time in a long while, I felt close to breaking. But the thought of the Gestapo's hands closing around me forced me onward. Freedom was not behind me, it was ahead. When we finally crossed into Spain, the relief was overwhelming. Some cried, some simply collapsed. I stood there, staring back toward the mountains, knowing that everything I had known, the life with Henri, the streets of Marseille, the network I had helped build, was now behind me. I was safe, but safety can feel like its own form of loss. I reached England after a long journey through Spain and Portugal, thin, exhausted, and carrying the invisible weight of everyone and everything I had left behind. London was bracing for war, preparing for what seemed like an impossible fight. But for the first time since the occupation began, I felt I could do more than run. I could strike back. In London, I was processed, questioned, and evaluated by British intelligence. They wanted to know everything, what I had done, who I had helped, how I had avoided capture for so long. I told them the truth. I had done what anyone should do when faced with tyranny. I had refused to bow. But what I did not tell them was the private war inside me. I had escaped, but escape did not feel like victory. I could not stop thinking about Henri, about the people still fighting in France, about the network I had left behind. Safety felt hollow when those you cared for remained in danger. The British understood that I had knowledge, experience, and something far more valuable, the will to keep fighting. I was no longer just a woman helping people flee. I had become someone the enemy feared, and Britain had a use for people like that. Yet, before I could begin again, I had to face the only truth that threatened to break me. In saving myself, I had left Henri behind. I had no way of knowing if we would ever see each other again, or if the war would swallow him before I returned. I carried that guilt with me like a second shadow. But guilt is a luxury war rarely allows. There was work to be done, and I was determined to return to France, not as a fugitive this time, but as a trained weapon. My escape across the Pyrenees had taken nearly everything from me, my strength, my safety, and the life I had built with Henri. But it had given me one thing in return, the chance to continue the fight on a scale I could never have reached in Marseille. I vowed that if I ever returned to France, I would not be the same woman who had fled. I would return stronger, smarter, and ready to face the enemy head-on. I arrived in England thin, tired, and with a head full of images I could not shake. London was different from Marseille, the danger was distant, but the war felt nearer in a new way, organized, deliberate, a machine preparing to strike back. They moved me through buildings with small signs and quiet doors. I was processed, questioned, and eventually passed on to a group whose work would change everything for me, the Special Operations Executive. The essay did not look like a glamorous school. It was practical, spare, and relentless. Training was designed to make ordinary people into extraordinary ones, people who could be dropped behind enemy lines and survive long enough to do damage. I was examined, tested, and watched. They asked about my experiences, my contacts, how I had moved in France. They valued what I had done, but they wanted more: discipline, technique, and understanding of methods I had only learned by instinct. There was a bitterness I had to swallow. Many in authority still expected women to be delicate, to be kept away from hard work. I remember an instructor who raised an eyebrow when I said I had smuggled people across borders and used forged papers. He seemed surprised, as if such things were not for women. I learned to let surprise work for me, to allow assumptions to be made and then to shatter them with competence. Training pushed me in ways that were unfamiliar. We learned to use weapons, to assemble and disassemble them blindfolded. We practiced silent movements. We studied sabotage techniques and radio operation. We rehearsed the art of disappearing into a crowd. They taught us how to read maps in the dark, to memorize routes, to forge documents in a way that could fool a practiced eye. Everything was taught with a cold precision. Do this, do it well, and do not draw attention. The physical demands were hard. We ran, we climbed, we crawled. We were hammered until our muscles ached and our minds sharpened. But the mental training was harder still. We were taught to live with ambiguity, to accept that betrayal could come from anywhere, and to act decisively even when the path ahead was unclear. They tested our endurance with long nights alone, with radios that crackled snippets of conversation, with exercises that forced us to make impossible choices under pressure. I surprised some instructors, and I surprised myself. Where others hesitated, I found an inner stubbornness that would not be broken. I felt my confidence grow, less the brash certainty of youth and more of a steady, tempered resolve. I learned to work with men who underestimated me at first, then depended on me later. Bonds were formed in those hours of shared fatigue and fear. We were not simply trainees. We were a small army of people prepared to return to darkness and act. There were moments of levity, two brief instances where we laughed at our own clumsy attempts, shared cigarettes, or traded stories of narrow escapes. Those small human moments kept us sane. But beneath the laughter was an understanding. If we failed, the people we would help would not survive. Failure was not an abstract possibility. It was a sentence for neighbors, for families, for friends. One particular lesson stayed with me, the art of blending in. We practiced becoming unremarkable, uninteresting. If a person is forgettable, then scrutiny passes them by. I learned to make my face the kind that could be dismissed, the manner that seemed ordinary. It was a strange skill, cultivating ordinariness in order to survive the extraordinary. When the instructors announced that some of us would be returned to France, it felt like the moment my life had been steering toward. I was not the same woman who had crossed the sea months before. I was hardened, instructed, and armed with methods that gave me a new kind of power. I carried with me the faces of those I had trained with, the quiet determination in their eyes, and the knowledge that returning meant I would have to be harder than the life I had led before. Before we were sent back, we were given practical tasks that would become our daily bread in occupied territories: radio discipline, coded messaging, the use of wireless sets under constant risk of detection. Radio work was particularly feared because the Germans had powerful direction-finding equipment. We learned to keep transmissions short, to change locations quickly, to disguise the timing of messages in ways that would make tracking nearly impossible. The radio operators were the invisible lifeline between London and the cells on the ground. They kept the supply lines alive and the plans coordinated. I admired their courage and their terrifying isolation. We were also instructed in the psychology of interrogation, how to hold a face, how to answer questions in a way that revealed nothing, how to use silence as a shield. They taught us to carry layers of deception, stories within stories, so that even under pressure, there would be something to hold to. We practiced these routines until deception became a reflex, a second nature as instinctive as breathing. Selections were brutal. Not everyone who came to training returned to the field. Some were reassigned, some were kept as instructors, others were told they were not ready. It was a mercy and a cruelty at the same time. I remember a fellow trainee, a quiet young man with a steady hand, who was told he could not be sent because his nerves would not hold. He left with his head bowed. He later found other ways to help. The decision of who went and who stayed was never easy, but it was always made in the knowledge that lives would hang on those choices. When my name was finally called for deployment, the sense of purpose I felt was overwhelming. I would return not as a fugitive, but as an agent trained, prepared, and backed by an organization that had the resources to strike at the heart of the occupation. There was fear, of course, fear of capture, fear of failing the people we had left behind, but there was also a clarity. I knew what I had to do. I had been given tools to make a difference on a scale I had only dreamed of in Marseille. The farewell was quiet. We did not parade our courage. We hugged, we promised to be careful, and then we moved into the night. For me, the training had transformed the chaos of the past years into a plan. It turned raw defiance into something deliberate, a campaign of small, precise acts that could, cumulatively, strike real blows. I boarded the plane or the small craft that would take me back across the channel with a weight in my chest and a purpose burning in my bones. The woman who stepped onto that boat carried with her the lessons of the SOE: discipline, deception, endurance, and the knowledge that courage must be guided by skill. I was ready to return to the shadows, now with intention and method. I returned to France under a moonlit sky, not as a fugitive, but as a weapon. The small aircraft hummed through the cold night as we approached the drop zone deep in occupied territory. Every one of us on board knew the stakes. If anything went wrong, if the landing was compromised, if the wrong eyes spotted us, the mission would end before it even began. I checked my equipment one last time. The training had become instinct. Weapons secured, documents hidden, the small tools of sabotage pressed against my body. But beneath the discipline, I felt something far more personal rising within me. I was coming home. Not to safety, not to the life I had left behind, but to the land I had sworn to defend. When the door opened, the wind rushed in sharp, cold, carrying the scent of fields and soil I had longed for. The jump master shouted the command, and one by one, we stepped into the night. The moment I leapt, the world fell silent. For a few seconds, there was nothing but darkness and the sound of air rushing past my ears. Then the parachute opened, pulling me upward with a sudden jolt, and I drifted down toward a France that was both familiar and changed beyond recognition. My feet touched French soil with a soft thud. I knelt, pressing my hand to the earth. It was not the Marseille I had left, not the France of cafes and quiet streets. It was a wounded country, scarred by occupation, but it was still mine, and I had come back to fight for it. The reception team moved quickly. There was no time for sentiment. We gathered the parachutes, concealed the landing zone, and slipped into the shadows. From this moment forward, every sound, every light, every unfamiliar movement carried danger. The rules of survival returned instantly: trust sparingly, speak little, and remain unseen. I was taken to a safe house where whispers replaced greetings. Faces were older, thinner, marked by years of fear and resistance. They looked at me not as the woman who had once run messages through Marseille, but as someone sent back by the British with purpose. Expectations hung heavy in the air, but so did hope. France had changed. The occupation was harsher, the German presence heavier. Collaborators had multiplied, and fear had tightened its grip on towns and villages. Yet, beneath that fear, the resistance had grown stronger, more organized, more determined. They needed weapons, coordination, and someone willing to lead. I hadn't returned just to join the fight. I had returned to help ignite it. The first days were spent in the shadows, re-establishing contact with networks that had been fractured by arrests, betrayals, and executions. Many of the people I once knew were gone, killed, imprisoned, or vanished without a trace. The war had reshaped the landscape of loyalty. Those still standing were sharper, harder, and more cautious than before. I moved under false identities, traveling by night, blending into the background by day. Every village held both allies and informants. Smiles could not be trusted, and silence often meant survival. Yet when I met the eyes of those still fighting, I saw the same flame burning that had driven me into the resistance years earlier. They had suffered, but they had not broken. Weapons and supplies were scarce, morale was fragile, and the Germans were tightening their control with ruthless efficiency. Food was rationed, curfews enforced. The Gestapo had refined their methods, becoming faster, crueler, more systematic in hunting down dissent. Returning to France was like stepping onto a chessboard where the opponent already knew most of your moves. But I had changed too. I was no longer the woman improvising in the streets of Marseille. Training had sharpened me, and exile had hardened me. I understood strategy, organization, how to build networks that could withstand infiltration. And I was prepared to do whatever was necessary to fracture the German grip on this land. London had not sent me back alone. I was to link with local resistance groups, unite them where possible, coordinate supply drops, and prepare them for the storm that was coming D-Day. France would not be liberated by whispers and small acts of defiance anymore. It needed sabotage, disruption, and organized rebellion. As I sat in a dark cellar lit only by a flickering candle, a map spread before me, I felt the clarity of purpose settle inside me. Roads, rail lines, garrisons, communication hubs, each marked with potential for damage. We would disrupt their transport, cripple their reinforcements, and make occupation as costly as possible. The resistance needed leadership infused with conviction and fearlessness, someone who believed, utterly, that the impossible was worth attempting. I had not returned simply to survive the occupation. I had returned to help end it. This time, I would not run. This time, I would make sure the enemy did. I began to build what we called an army of shadows. It was not an army in the uniform sense. There were no ranks on nice paper, no polished badges, only people with jobs to do and the quiet agreement that their lives from that moment on belonged to something larger than themselves. My task was to stitch these scattered threads together: smugglers, farmers, students, former soldiers, women who ran households and hid fugitives. Their skills were different, but their purpose was the same. We moved with speed and smallness. A blacksmith who knew how to hide a weapon in a cart. A market vendor who could pass a message tucked inside a loaf of bread. Young men who knew the terrain like the backs of their hands. I found people who could be trusted because they had already risked everything. Trust was our currency, and I guarded it jealously. Training was both practical and psychological. I taught people how to spot a trap, how to pass a message without drawing attention, how to use a detonator without blowing themselves up, and how to look ordinary when danger passed close. We practiced walking with purpose and without purpose, learning the difference between confidence and bravado. We drilled on silence, the kind of silence that keeps a man alive. We rehearsed evacuations, stashing weapons, and destroying evidence in a way that left nothing to be traced back. We worked in cells, small and independent, so that if one failed, the others could carry on. Communication was a careful choreography of people and signals, postcards with a single unusual word, a flower on a balcony, a light in a window at a particular hour. Every method was mundane enough to avoid notice and precise enough to carry meaning to those who knew the code. I remember the first supply drop we coordinated, crates loaded under cover of night, planes that passed over in the darkness, the terrible relief when we recovered what we had signaled for: medical supplies, weapons, rubber boats, radios. Those crates changed our capacity. They turned scattered acts of kindness into coordinated campaigns. With supplies came the possibility of larger operations, attacks on rail lines, the interruption of communication, the destruction of depots that fed frontline troops. We targeted what mattered to their war machine. Railways became prizes. Destroy a bridge or derail a convoy, and the enemy's reinforcements slowed. Sabotage was an equalizer. It was the language of the weak against the strong. But it demanded precision and patience. A burned bridge could save lives if timed correctly. A miscalculated explosion could kill civilians and break the trust we had fought so hard to build. Leadership was less about orders and more about responsibility. I could not simply command from above. I had to be in the same risk as those I asked to act. I learned to make decisions that balanced boldness with the duty to preserve lives. There were times when I authorized actions that cost us dearly, and nights when I sat awake wondering if I had been right. Regret does not end in war. It waits in the quiet afterward that we also had to be clever with information. The Germans relied on patterns and reports. We fed them false patterns, staged activities that drew attention to one area while the real work happened somewhere else. Diversion became as important as direct action. We used the enemy's certainty against them, and the confusion that followed was our ally. Recruitment was an intimate process. I could not simply ask someone to risk their life without understanding their reasons. Many joined because they had seen cruelty firsthand, others because they had nothing left to lose. Some came for revenge, some for survival, and some because, like me, they had an anger that would not be quieted by watching injustice. I listened to their stories, weighed their strengths, and placed them where they would be most effective. Women were the backbone of many of our operations. They could move supplies, hide people, pass messages in plain sight. They were underestimated in ways that worked to our advantage. I relied on mothers who would not be suspected of carrying bombs in prams, on seamstresses who could stitch pockets into garments, on school teachers who could whisper codes into the ears of children destined to carry warnings. The everyday became the cover for extraordinary deeds. There were betrayals that cut like knives. A man we believed loyal turned his face toward the enemy when a price was set on his family. The weight of those betrayals was heavy. We mourned quietly, then adjusted. The work demanded a kind of emotional armor. Too soft, and you were vulnerable. too hard and you lost what made you human. I tried to find the balance between compassion and the ruthless clarity needed to keep people alive. As our operations grew, so did the scope of what we attempted. We coordinated with Allied intelligence, passing information about troop movements and supply routes. We planned attacks to coincide with larger Allied offensives. When D-Day approached, our work shifted from survival to outright disruption. We cut wires, burned stores of fuel, and made it impossible for the enemy to move forces quickly. Those months were some of the most intense of my life. Every success felt like a small triumph toward a larger hope. There were moments of unexpected grace. A successful raid that freed prisoners who had given up hope, a sabotage train that never reached the front, a messenger who returned safe against all odds. Those moments kept us moving. They were proof that our risks had meaning and that ordinary people could, together, shape history in ways that seemed impossible. I did not lead alone. I built networks of leaders, people who could take charge when I was away, who could make decisions without waiting for me. Delegation was critical. Too many operations fail because one person tries to hold the whole web together. I learned to trust lieutenants who had proved themselves in the small things, and I gave them the space to act decisively. Through it all, I understood something fundamental. The work of resistance is not glorious in a way that history likes to tell. It is repetitive, exhausting, and often anonymous. The real victories were quiet. Phone lines cut at the right moment, a family smuggled out to safety, a depot rendered unusable. Those were the blows that bled the occupation slowly and steadily. And always, under every plan and every act, there was the danger of capture. We operated with that risk as a constant companion, measuring choices with the knowledge that one mistake could unravel months of careful work. Still, we pressed on, because to stop would be to surrender everything we had fought to protect. In the end, building the army of shadows was a test of human resourcefulness. It demanded imagination as much as courage, patience as much as rage, and a relentless refusal to accept the world as it had been forced to become. We were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but we were necessary, an inconvenient answer to an enemy that believed its dominance unshakable. We proved, day by day, how wrong they were. We struck where it hurt them most, the arteries that fed their armies. Rail lines, bridges, fuel depots, telephone exchanges. Not for glory, but because an enemy that cannot move is an enemy that cannot hold. We learned to watch timetables like prayers, to know which trains carried soldiers and which carried supplies, and to pick the moments when a single act could ripple into delay and confusion. Sabotage was meticulous work. We did not blow things up for the spectacle of it. We prepared, timed, and calculated. A burned sleeper here, a loosened rail spike there, the subtle removal of a signaling bolt. Each small act could force a convoy to halt for hours, to reroute, to leave men stranded and tanks idle. The Germans had machinery and manpower, but they could not repair every point at once. We became specialists in turning a routine route into a problem they could not ignore. I remember the cold logic of one operation. We had information that a train carrying fuel would pass through a narrow cutting at dawn. The radios told us the window. Men placed charges in the dark, hearts steady, and withdrew to a safe distance. When the blast tore through the rails, the convoy halted in a cloud of smoke and chaos. Soldiers scrambled. Engineers cursed. What they did not know was that behind that incident, dozens of supply schedules had to be rewritten, reinforcements delayed, and plans thrown into disarray. The result was not just a moment of panic. It was a chain reaction that bought time for larger Allied movements. But sabotage had a moral cost. We measured every risk against the lives of civilians who might be harmed by misplaced debris or miscalculated timing. There were rules we never broke. Avoid civilian casualties, warn where possible, and choose targets whose disruption would not spill blood among those we sought to protect. That line was razor thin at times, and I carried the weight of it after every operation. There were nights when I revisited maps in my head, wondering if one different decision might have spared an innocent life. Regret in war does not evaporate. It becomes part of the ledger you carry. We also turned small, ordinary things into instruments of resistance. Farmers who hid explosives under hay bales, fishermen who ferried men across rivers, bakers who had coded messages inside loaves. The everyday became a theater of subterfuge. I learned that the best disguise was normality, a cart piled with produce, a woman with a basket at market, while underneath, the tools of disruption waited. Communication was the skeleton on which all actions hung. Radio operators worked in solitude, transmitting brief bursts of data back to London so that supplies could be dropped on moonlit clearings or plans could be aligned with Allied offensives. Those operators lived in a kind of suspended danger. Every transmission risked detection by a machine the enemy used to home in on signals. We showed them the kind of reverence reserved for people who hold the line between life and death. When we timed attacks to larger operations, the effect multiplied. In the weeks leading up to the Allied invasion, our work shifted from individual disruption to coordinated paralysis. We cut wires, burned stores of fuel, sabotaged rail junctions, not merely to impede, but to shape the battlefield. We were, in many ways, the unseen hand that made it harder for the occupiers to throw men and material to trouble spots. There were raids that felt like small miracles, a patrol that found an empty depot, stale with the scent of powder and disappointment, a bridge that collapsed under its own weight after we removed key support, leaving the enemy to reroute for days. We celebrated quietly when plans worked, not with fanfare, but with an exhausted, private relief. Every success was the rescue of some other life, the saving of a village from reprisal because the enemy had been delayed. Yet success brought consequences. The Germans became more ruthless and more cunning. They set traps, used collaborators to feed them false leads, and employed brutal reprisals against populations near sabotaged sites. We had to weigh each move against the potential for collective punishment. Sometimes, after an operation, we would learn that nearby villages had been burned or hostages taken. The knowledge that our actions could bring terror upon civilians was a burden that never left me. Still, doing nothing felt like a different kind of surrender. Not all our plans went perfectly. I knew the sting of mistakes, an explosive set too early, a courier betrayed, an ambush that met not soldiers but frightened civilians fleeing a town. Those failures taught us to be more cautious, to build redundancies, to plan for contingencies. We never acted out of bravado. The work demanded precision, humility, and the ability to adapt when the unexpected arrived. There were moments of fierce improvisation, too, when a plan unspooled and we had to create new pathways on the fly. Once, when an attack was compromised, our team scattered into orchards and vineyards, emerging hours later in a different village with fewer supplies but more determination. In those moments, survival depended on the resourcefulness of ordinary people willing to risk everything for one another. I learned to accept a paradox of resistance. We were both architects of violence and guardians against cruelty. Sabotage sought to break the enemy's capacity to harm, but it also invited danger. The balance between striking back and protecting civilians was the delicate art we mastered through bitter experience. Sometimes the choice was clear, often it was not. Through it all, one truth remained. The occupation was a machine that relied on movement, on logistics, on the quiet procession of supplies and communications. Take that away, even for a day, and the machine sputtered. We were not powerful in the traditional sense, but we were disruptive. That disruption saved lives, delayed offensives, and carved space for soldiers coming from across the channel. When the storm of D-Day finally broke, we watched as the consequences of months of small, precise strikes multiplied into something irreversible. The enemy scrambled to respond, and the window we had created widened into a gap through which liberation could begin. I did not stand at the beaches that day, but I felt the tide turn with a force I could almost touch. The sabotage, the nights of danger, the losses and the quiet triumphs, they had not been in vain. Even so, celebration was muted. For every gain, there was a ledger of suffering. We mourned those we had lost, tended to those who returned broken, and steeled ourselves for the next set of decisions. The work continued until the final days of occupation, because the fight to free our country was not a single event, but an accumulation of countless acts, each one placing a weight against oppression. In the end, sabotage was less about spectacle and more about responsibility. The responsibility to do what was necessary to bring an end to a cruel rule, and to carry on with the careful, tireless labor that made victory possible. There was one night that people still speak of in whispers, the kind of operation that took on a life of its own and became the story told long after the maps had been folded away. I had planned for months, not because I wanted fame, but because the price of failure was counted in lives. We had intelligence that a column of enemy vehicles would move through a narrow valley at dawn, carrying men and supplies that would strengthen the garrisons for weeks to come. If that convoy moved unmolested, entire towns would be easier to control and more innocent people would be at risk. We prepared with the kind of care that comes from knowing what is at stake. Men and women I trusted with my life moved like shadows, placing charges, watching lines of sight, marking timing. I remember studying the slope of the road, the position of hedgerows, the moment the sun would hit the metal and make the soldiers blink. Small advantages become great at that hour. When the convoy came, we struck with a quiet cruelty that was almost clinical. The explosion was not for spectacle. It was a lever. Rails split, a wheel jammed, soldiers tumbled into confusion. They had strength in numbers, yes, but not in speed when the rails and roads betrayed them. Our teams moved with precision, cutting communications, blocking retreat, and creating a pocket of disarray. In those hours, we were not simply insurgents. We were the thin blade that severed a vital link in a machine built to crush us. There was a point when the enemy tried to reorganize, to push back through force. They were disciplined and cruel, but they were surprised. Surprise is a kind of power. Our men and women held firm. They fought to keep the corridor closed until the last of the convoy was rendered useless. When it was over, the valley smelled of smoke and of something else: relief, exhaustion, the raw feeling of having wrested time from an enemy who believed itself unstoppable. In the immediate confusion, the Gestapo sent inquiries, and rumors spread quickly through their ranks. They began to whisper of a woman who cut through their plans, who seemed to anticipate their moves as if she had access to the enemy's mind. That whisper grew into a name that traveled through offices and barracks: the White Mouse. The name carried with it an irritation they could not hide, an admission that their control was imperfect. I never set out to become a legend. I set out to do the work required to keep people alive. But there are moments in war when action itself becomes an emblem. The night of the convoy became one of those moments. People we had saved in the aftermath called us saints. Others called us terrorists. I learned to live with both labels, knowing that labels were for those who sat safe and judged, not for those who slept on cold floors and woke to continue the fight. There was also the cost. In the days that followed, reprisals came to nearby villages. I remember receiving word that houses had burned, that men had been dragged from their beds and executed as examples. We had tried to calculate and minimize such risks, but nothing in conflict is perfectly contained. Each success had an echo, and sometimes the echo harmed the very people we meant to protect. The knowledge of that outcome bit into me more deeply than any scar. Still, if the alternative was allowing the enemy to move unchallenged, to let reinforcement lines run free, then action was necessary. We weighed those choices daily: the chance that a life would be endangered by our strike, versus the larger calculus of saving countless more if an advance could be delayed. Those moral decisions never left us. They sat in the dark corners of our minds like unpaid debts. People later described the operation as daring and nearly impossible. Men who had once hidden in fear came forward after that night with a new look in their eyes. Others who had been indifferent found reasons to risk themselves for strangers. In small towns and farms across the region, a tiny flame of resistance grew brighter because people had seen that the occupier was not invincible. When the Gestapo intensified their hunt after that operation, I understood the price of being effective. They sharpened their methods. Interrogations became more brutal, and collaborators were rewarded. But they had also revealed a weakness. Their need for order made them brittle when order was disrupted. We learned to exploit that brittle edge. The legend that followed was a mixture of admiration and amplification. Stories grew taller with every telling. Some began to think I was unstoppable. Others feared me more than they feared the soldiers with their guns. The myth became a tool of its own. When people believed in the possibility of resistance, they were more likely to act. That, perhaps more than any single act of sabotage, was the real game. I carried the memory of that night like a wound and a badge. It proved that careful planning and human courage could create space in a world that seemed wholly controlled. But it also kept me awake with the faces of those who paid for our victories. In the end, the operation did not make me proud in a simple way. It made me responsible in a deeper way, and responsibility is a heavier garment than glory. When I look back now, I see that the night did two things. It broke a line of enemy movement at a crucial time, and it changed how ordinary people saw the possibility of fighting back. For all the suffering that followed, for all the losses that shadowed our steps, I would not have traded that one night for an easier conscience. The work we did was born of necessity, and sometimes necessity demands the hardest choices. Before liberation came, there was a period when exhaustion lived in our bones. We were constantly moving, planning, recalibrating. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, meals were whatever could be scrounged, and fear, though ever present, had become something almost mundane. The extraordinary had become our ordinary. By then, we had grown into something larger than a network. We had become a force. The Germans no longer dismissed us as scattered troublemakers. They recognized us as an organized threat, and they reacted like a cornered animal, violent, unpredictable, and desperate. It was in this fragile balance, between near collapse and relentless resolve, that the final efforts of the Shadow War took shape. With D-Day approaching, London's messages shifted from preparation to execution. We received orders that required every resource, every contact, and every ounce of human what we had left. We were to paralyze German movement across entire regions. Roads, rails, communications, everything had to break at once and stay broken. Coordinating such a wide effort tested the limits of our secrecy and our nerves. Cells that had never met one another had to act in synchrony, knowing that a single compromised member could unravel the entire operation. I met with leaders in darkened barns, in forest clearings, inside abandoned mills. We spoke in low voices, weighed maps with stones to stop them fluttering in the draft, and memorized our roles until the plans lived inside our muscles and minds. The night the signal came, the air felt electric. It was as though the land itself held its breath. Our teams moved silently, each step a culmination of years of defiance. Explosives placed along rail lines, trucks stalled to block roads, telegraph wires cut in the dark. Fires that would confuse the enemy, diversions that would pull them in the wrong direction. It was a symphony of sabotage, violent, precise, and strangely beautiful in the unity it represented. When the news of the landings reached us, a tremor passed through the resistance. We had known something was coming, but not when and not where. Now that it was real, our task sharpened. We were not to join the beach assault. Our job was to hold the knife at the arteries of the occupation, making it bleed from within so that the Allied forces could cut through from without. The Germans responded with fury. They sent patrols into the countryside, turning villages upside down, seizing hostages, and striking with a savagery bred from fear. We took losses, we lost safe houses, and we buried people we could not honor openly. But we held. For every cell that fell, two more rose, fueled by anger and the taste of possibility. And for the first time in years, possibility felt like a thing that might survive the night. Among my own fighters, a transformation took place. I watched men who once trembled at the thought of hiding a leaflet now lead teams that derailed trains or ambushed convoys. I saw women who began as messengers now coordinate entire sectors of communication, sending coded signals across towns without a single word spoken aloud. The timid became fearless, not because fear vanished, but because they learned to move through it. The most moving change was in the villages. People who had once kept their heads down now stood a little straighter. Farmers offered more than hiding places. They offered their sons. Mothers, who once shook as they handed over bread, now pressed notes into my palm without flinching. Resistance had become not the act of a few, but the identity of many. And then came the moment we had waited for, the moment when the enemy began to withdraw. It did not happen with drums or trumpets, but with whispers that spread like dawn across the hills. Roadblocks were abandoned. German trucks rolled through the night, heading east with urgency rather than dominance. We watched them go with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Years of tension did not unwind in an instant. They trembled free of us slowly, like the aftershocks of a storm. We liberated towns not with armies, but with sheer presence. When the Germans left, people emerged cautiously, as if afraid the enemy would return and punish them for celebrating. And then, when the certainty settled in, joy took hold. Flags that had been hidden under floorboards were lifted. Songs whispered for years were sung aloud. Children ran through streets that had known only silence and boots. I did not stay to be celebrated. There was always another task, another group to stabilize, another pocket of danger to dismantle. Liberation was not a single moment. It was a process, a healing, and there was too much left undone to rest in any one town's applause. But I remember one night, after a day of frantic coordination and travel, stepping out into the cool air of the countryside. The sky was clear, and for the first time in a long time, I heard something I had almost forgotten. Laughter carried on the wind. It was not the tense, brittle laughter of defiance, but the warm, careless laughter of people who had tasted freedom. It was then that I understood the true scale of what we had built. We had not just sabotaged railways or blown bridges. We had taught a country to believe again. And belief, once restored, is harder to occupy than any territory. The army of shadows had done what it set out to do. We had made occupation costly. We had kept hope alive. And when the moment came, we had helped make liberation possible. We had fought without uniforms, without promise of reward, without certainty of survival. And because of that, our victory belonged not to generals or governments, but to the ordinary people who risked everything when everything was already taken from them. They say a hunted person can sense when the net is tightening. I felt it in the shift of the air, in the way doors closed a second too quickly when I walked by, in the silence that settled over safe houses that once greeted me with whispers of welcome. The Gestapo was closer than ever before. We had been operating at full force for weeks. Sabotage, coordination, sheltering men, moving weapons. Tension had replaced sleep. One night, as I studied a map under the faint light of an oil lamp, a courier burst through the door, breathless. They're asking about a woman, your description. No name, no photograph, but enough to turn suspicion into identification if I stayed still for too long. I left before dawn. From that moment, survival became a series of seconds, timed, stolen, stretched. Safe houses that had been sanctuaries were suddenly unsafe. I never remained anywhere more than a night, sometimes only an hour. I burned anything that carried my handwriting. I memorized routes, signals, exits. I learned to control my breathing so I wouldn't give myself away in the dark. One evening, as I crossed a narrow street toward a barn where we were meant to meet, a voice came from the shadows. Stop. Not here. A hand gripped my arm and pulled me back. It was Lewis, one of our best couriers, eyes sharp with fear. Patrol. 2 streets over, he whispered. They're asking for papers. Women, too. It wasn't usual for the Gestapo to check women so aggressively. It meant they were adapting, learning that the old assumptions no longer protected them. We doubled back, keeping to alleys and orchards. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and both of us froze. For a moment, I could hear only the echo of my own pulse. When nothing followed, we moved again, but faster. The next day, the blow struck. One of our radio operators failed to make the rendezvous. At first, we hoped it was a broken bicycle, a delayed transmission. But by nightfall, we knew. He had been taken. A captured radio operator was a catastrophe. Under torture, even the strongest crack, not through weakness, but because no one can withstand the Gestapo's methods indefinitely. We immediately shut down every network tied to him. Codes changed. Contacts scattered. It was like cutting off limbs to save the body. But the damage had already begun. Someone talked. A farmer told us, his face pale. They know your code name. The White Mouse was no longer just a rumor. Now they wanted the woman behind it. The pressure was suffocating. We moved constantly through forests, pastures, cellars, attics. Some nights, there wasn't even a floor to lie on, just dirt and roots and the hope that dawn would come quietly. Food became whatever we could find or trade. Stale bread, hard cheese, apples stolen from orchards under the moon. During one move, we hid in a church while German boots thundered past the doors. I pressed myself behind the stone altar with two young resistance fighters who trembled in the dark. One of them, barely 18, couldn't control his breathing. I placed a hand on his chest. "Slow," I whispered. "In, out. Quiet." He nodded, tears streaking through the grime on his face. When the steps faded, he let out the breath he'd been holding. Not long after, the worst happened. A traitor. Not a villain by nature, just a terrified man who'd been caught and broken, as so many were. Under torture, he had spoken my name. My real name. From that moment, every shadow felt like a threat. Every knock like an ending. I remember the night I understood how close death had come. We were in a cottage on the outskirts of a village. I had just sat down to rest, my first moment off my feet in 2 days, when headlights swept across the window. "Go." Now, the owner hissed. We slipped out the back just as cars pulled up. The Gestapo moved fast and ruthlessly. Dogs barked, doors slammed, boots pounded the ground. We ran across fields, breath ragged, stumbling without direction. The moon lit the wheat just enough to show a path, and we sprinted until our lungs burned. A shot cracked the air, then another. Someone fell behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I stopped, if I hesitated, his sacrifice meant nothing. His final cry still lives in the hollow of my memory. We reached the tree lean and dropped to the ground, covered in mud and sweat. For minutes, long, stretched, unbearable, we listened. Dogs barking, men shouting, then silence. That silence felt like both mercy and mourning. It was after that night that I allowed myself one moment of honesty. I might die here. Not in battle, not in glory, but in the dirt, in the dark, alone, or beside people who never asked for this. What haunted me most was the thought of Henri. I had left once, promising I'd return. War had kept us apart, destiny had bent our lives out of shape, and now death circled closer each day. I didn't fear dying, but I feared dying without seeing his face one last time. Still, slowing down was not an option. The harder they hunted, the more vital my work became. If they were dedicating entire units to capturing one woman, then that woman still mattered. We improvised new tactics. No messages on paper. No fixed meeting points. Movement became our shield. Mobility, our weapon. The net was closing, but I was still free. Still moving. Still fighting. And if the Gestapo wanted the White Mouse, they would have to catch me in the dark. The roads were still scarred from battle when whispers of liberation reached us. We'd been hiding so long that the idea of daylight without danger felt unreal. Somewhere beyond the hills, the Allies were pushing north. The rhythm of war was changing. One night a boy arrived from a nearby town, mud on his face, eyes wide. "They're retreating," he said. "The Germans are leaving." No one moved. We had learned not to trust hope too easily. But that night, from the forest, I heard something I hadn't heard in years singing. Distant, rough voices carried through the dark. It wasn't soldiers. It was villagers. The next morning, the horizon burned gold with dust and smoke. I walked into the open for the first time in months. Fields torn by shells now shimmered with light. My hands trembled, not from fear, but disbelief. As we entered the outskirts of Limoges, crowds appeared from cellars and barns. Women waved white cloths, children clung to their mothers. A man climbed a lamppost to hang the tricolor. Someone shouted "Vive la France," and the cry rippled through the streets. For a heartbeat, I let myself breathe. But joy came tangled with ghosts. Every street I looked at, I saw faces missing. Friends who hadn't survived to see this day. Louis found me near the river. "It's over, Nancy," he said softly. I looked at him and shook my head. No, not yet. Not for all of us. Because even in freedom, the dead still held us by the heart. The following days blurred into chaos and relief. The streets filled with flags, songs, tears. Men who had once whispered in cellars now marched openly with rifles held high. We stood among them, exhausted, hollow, smiling through disbelief. Someone handed me a glass of wine. I hadn't tasted one in years. It burned, and I laughed for the first time since the invasion. But beneath that laughter, guilt pulsed like an old wound. So many of us had survived by chance. and chance had no mercy. In the square, they brought out collaborators, men and women who had worked with the occupiers. The crowd shouted, some threw stones, others turned away. Justice was raw, furious, uncontrollable. I couldn't watch. I walked away through the alleyways where the smell of smoke still lingered. Lewis caught up to me later. "You should come to the square tonight," he said. "They're lighting candles for the ones we lost." I nodded but didn't go. Instead, I sat by the river until night fell, listening to the water carry the echoes of celebration. When freedom finally came, it didn't feel like triumph, it felt like quiet. The kind of silence that follows a scream too long held inside. I went back to one of our safe houses a few days later. Inside, everything was the same: the cot, the old lamp, the smell of dust and oil. But it wasn't the same. The war had ended outside, but inside us it still moved, slow and heavy. That's where I found a letter, faded, tucked under a loose board. Addressed to me. The handwriting stopped my breath. It was Henry's. My hands shook as I opened it. The ink was faded, the words uneven, written in haste. He'd written it before being captured. The letter was short. "If you're reading this, it means I failed to come back. But don't let the darkness keep you. Live. You always told me courage was more than surviving, it was remembering who we are. So remember me, but don't stop living." I read it again and again until the letters blurred. He had been taken months earlier, during a raid on a railway line we had sabotaged together. We had assumed he was dead, but now, holding his words, I knew he had faced it knowingly, calmly. That was Henri, quiet strength, no self-pity, no farewell, just conviction. I sat there until dawn. Outside, the bells of liberation rang across the valley. But for me, that morning was a requiem. Freedom had come, but the cost was carved into the bones of every survivor. The war was ending, but not for all of us. Some of us would carry it forever. For days after reading the letter, I walked through the countryside, half alive. People were celebrating, rebuilding, embracing, but I moved through them like a ghost. Every church bell sounded like a goodbye. Henry's words lived in my pocket, folded and refolded until the paper felt like skin. One evening, as I passed through a liberated village, a nurse stopped me. She was helping survivors from a nearby camp. "You worked with the resistance?" she asked. I nodded. "Then you should come. There's someone asking for you." I followed her through narrow streets to an old school turned into a field hospital. The smell of antiseptic and smoke filled the air. Inside, rows of stretchers lined the walls, faces pale and silent under bandages. The nurse pointed toward the last cot near the window. At first, I didn't see him. He was thinner, his hair almost white, eyes sunken, but when he turned his head, I knew. "Henri." He smiled faintly. "Took you long enough," he whispered. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I knelt beside him, afraid that if I touched him, he would vanish like a dream. His hand found mine cold, but alive. "They told me you were dead," I said. He shook his head. "Almost. But I kept hearing your voice in my head, telling me not to give up." We didn't speak much after that. There were no words strong enough for what had passed between us. Outside, people shouted, sang, kissed strangers in the streets. Inside, we just held on to the quiet. Henry's recovery was slow. The war had eaten into him, left him with a tremor in his hands, a cough that wouldn't fade. But every morning he insisted on sitting by the window to watch the light creep through the cracked glass. "I'd forgotten how sunlight smells," he said once, eyes half closed. We spoke little of what we had seen. Some truths were too heavy to give shape to. Instead, we traded small memories: the orchard behind his home, the way the leaves looked before autumn, the smell of bread on Sundays. It was our way of remembering we were human again. When the doctors said he could travel, we went south. The journey took days. The rail lines were twisted wrecks, the countryside a skeleton of burned villages. But each mile away from the front felt like breathing again. At night, we stayed in abandoned farmhouses. Sometimes, in the dark, he would wake gasping. I would hold his hand until his breathing slowed. He never told me what he saw behind his eyes, and I never asked. We had both seen enough ghosts. When we finally reached Toulouse, The city was half ruin, half rebirth. People were rebuilding walls, reopening cafes, laughing through dust. Henri looked at them and smiled faintly. "They're already living again," he said. "That's how you win." We found a small room above a bakery, warm from the ovens below. For the first time in years, I unpacked my bag and didn't plan my escape route. We cooked, we listened to the radio, we lived in small pieces. But time, like war, never truly stops, it only changes shape. The winter came early that year. The city grew quiet again, but not from fear, just exhaustion. Henry's cough worsened with the cold. He tried to hide it, but I could hear the struggle in every breath. "It's nothing," he said one morning, smiling through the pain. "Just old air from the camps leaving my lungs." But I knew better. War had a way of taking lives slowly, even after it ended. The last night we spent together, he sat by the window watching the snow fall. The light flickered across his face, soft and pale. He reached for my hand. "Promise me something," he whispered. "Don't become a ghost. Keep living. For both of us." I wanted to speak, to say everything that had been locked inside my heart for years, but no words came. He pressed my hand once more, then closed his eyes. By morning, the snow had stopped, and Henri was gone. Outside, the bells rang for peace again. This time I didn't cry. I just sat beside him, holding the silence between us. When they buried him, I placed his letter in the earth with him, the same one that had kept me alive through the war. Because his words didn't belong to me anymore, they belonged to the quiet he had earned. After the funeral, I walked through the city. Children were skating on the frozen river, laughing, their voices echoing through the cold. It was the sound of life beginning again. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an intruder among the living. When the war ended, the silence it left behind was almost unbearable. For years, I had lived by the rhythm of danger, the sound of boots, the coded knocks, the waiting. Now there was only quiet, and I didn't know what to do with it. The government wanted heroes, stories of victory, clear lines between good and evil. But the truth was never that simple. For many of us, heroism had come wrapped in guilt. We had survived where others hadn't. We had done what had to be done, even when it broke something inside us. They called me the White Mouse in the newspapers. They printed my name, my photograph. At first, it felt strange seeing my face next to words like hero and legend. Later, it just felt empty, because every headline left out the people who hadn't come home, the ones who had made my survival possible. For a while, I traveled lectures, ceremonies, medals pinned by trembling hands. People smiled, shook my hand, thanked me, but none of them had seen the faces of the men we lost or heard the sound of a code signal that never answered back. Sometimes, I woke in the night expecting to hear Henri coughing beside me or the whisper of a courier in the doorway. Old habits die slower than fear. In the years that followed, I learned to live small, to find comfort in the ordinary, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain, the warmth of a friend's voice. Those were the freedoms I had fought for, the ones worth keeping. The world moved on quickly. New wars began in distant places, new names filled the newspapers. For most people, the resistance became a story from another lifetime. But for those of us who lived it, it never really ended. It just changed shape. Sometimes people would stop me on the street. They wanted to hear stories, wanted the thrill of danger told safely in the past tense. I learned to give them what they wanted, a story polished like an old medal. But at night, when the crowds were gone, I still saw the faces. The boy in the church trying not to breathe. Louis disappearing in the wheat field. Henri smiling in the snow. They gave me medals, honors, even a title. Each time I smiled, said thank you, and left early. The applause always felt too loud. It drowned out the quiet voices of those who couldn't stand beside me. Years passed. I built a small life, nothing grand. A cottage near the sea, a garden that bloomed wild every spring. The salt air carried the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. Sometimes I would walk to the cliffs at sunset, close my eyes, and listen to the wind. It sounded almost like the static of an old radio, the kind we used to send messages through. And for a moment, it felt like the others were still out there, waiting for a signal. As the years passed, people began writing books about the war. Some called it the good war, others the necessary one. I never liked those words. There was nothing good or necessary about watching the world tear itself apart. When they interviewed me for one of those books, the writer asked, "What was the bravest thing you ever did?" I thought for a long time before answering. Learning to live after it was over, I said, because that was the hardest part. Living without missions, without codes, without fear to guide you. Learning to wake up without purpose and still choose to keep going. In time, the tremors of memory softened. The faces didn't haunt me as sharply, the names didn't echo so loud, but they never left. They became part of the air I breathed, the rhythm of every heartbeat. Sometimes, when I visited schools or spoke to younger generations, they asked what kept me fighting. I always told them the same thing. It wasn't hatred. It was love. Love for a world that deserved better than the one we had built. Love for people who still believed in kindness, even when surrounded by cruelty. I was no hero. I was a survivor. And survival, I learned, is its own kind of resistance. As I grew older, the world changed around me. The cities rebuilt, the borders shifted, and the war faded into pages of textbooks. Sometimes, people looked at me with polite disbelief when I told them what we had done. It was too far away now, too unimaginable. But the echoes never stopped. They lived in the small things, the way a train's whistle at night could still make me freeze, or how the smell of diesel brought back the whisper of danger. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. I often wondered what Henri would have thought of this new world. Would he have believed it was worth the cost? Maybe he would have smiled that same quiet smile and said, "It had to be." When people asked me for advice, I never spoke about war. I spoke about choice, about how every act of kindness, every refusal to turn away, is a small kind of resistance. You don't need a rifle to fight for what's right, you just need courage to care. I still kept one thing from the war, my radio. It no longer worked, but sometimes I'd sit beside it in the evenings, fingers tracing the worn knobs, imagining the crackle of voices through the static. Those who once called across the dark. Those who never answered again. The older I got, the more I realized something simple. We don't fight wars only with weapons, but with memory. Because forgetting is how it all begins again. In the final years of my life, I returned to the places where it all began. The old safe house in the hills, now a farmhouse once more. The bridge we blew up, rebuilt and busy with children crossing on bicycles. The church where we hid from the patrol, quiet now, sunlight resting on the stone. I lit a candle for each of the names I carried inside me. Not out of sorrow anymore, but gratitude. They had walked with me through every year after the war, and I was never truly alone. People often think courage is loud, a shout, a charge, a battle cry. But I learned that real courage is often quiet. It's a hand reaching for yours in the dark. It's choosing to live when the world you loved is gone. It's the soft voice that says, "Begin again." Before I left this world, a young girl once asked me, "Would you do it again?" I looked at her, her eyes bright, unscarred, full of the future. And I said yes, because someone had to. But the truth I carried with me was this: I didn't do it alone. None of us did. We were ordinary people who refused to bow. We were fear and bravery and doubt and hope tangled together. And that is what resistance truly is. If my story survives, let it not be a tale of glory, but a reminder. That freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility. And every generation must choose what kind of world they leave behind. So if someday you find yourself in a moment when the world turns dark, when cruelty rises, when fear spreads, when you feel small, remember this: a single voice can carry across the night. A single act of courage can light a fire. And what begins with one heart refusing to yield can save a nation. And if ever you're afraid, think of the girl they once called the White Mouse, and know that the smallest among us can change the course of history.